She chose her mother over me. Now she's losing everything. I never thought a simple family dinner could destroy my marriage. But as I stood there, my cheek burning from the slap, the stunned silence of the room pressing down on me, I realized the truth. I wasn't a husband in this house, I was an outsider. And my wife had just proved it. It happened so fast. One moment, I was reaching for my glass, the next, her mother's hand collided with my face. Hard. The sound echoed through the dining room, cutting through the conversation like a blade. Everyone froze. Her eyes burned with disgust as she hissed, "How dare you touch me?" I hadn't even touched her. Maybe my sleeve brushed hers when I moved past, but that didn't matter. Not in her world. To her, I was nothing. Less than nothing. And she had just reminded me of that in front of everyone. I turned to my wife, expecting something, anything. A word of defense. A shocked reaction. A simple, "Mom, that was too much." Instead, she just stared at me, her face unreadable. And then she said the words that made my entire world crack. Apologize to her. I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Surely, I had misheard. Apologize? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. Her arms crossed. You upset her. Something inside me shifted. I had tolerated her mother's insults for years. The snide remarks. The passive-aggressive digs. The way she never missed a chance to remind me that I wasn't good enough for her daughter. I had endured it all for my wife. For the woman I thought loved me. But this? This was different. I looked around the room, scanning the faces of her family. Some looked uncomfortable. Most avoided eye contact. Not one person stood up for me. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and did something I never thought I would do. I turned around and walked out. No yelling. No dramatic exit. Just quiet, final steps toward the door. I didn't look back. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire burning inside. My mind raced, replaying everything. The slap. The silence. My wife's words. She had chosen her mother over me. And that was a mistake she was going to regret. I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I could feel the heat of the humiliation still stinging my skin, but that wasn't the real wound. The real wound was deeper. I had given everything to this marriage. Years of love, sacrifice, and patience. And for what? To be dismissed like I was nothing? No. I wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. I reached for my phone and dialed the only person who would understand. The call barely rang twice before he picked up. What's up? His voice was casual, but I could hear the curiosity. I leaned back against the seat, staring at the dark sky through the windshield. I need you to dig into someone for me. Who? Her mother. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Finally ready to fight back? I clenched my jaw. More than ready. He exhaled, amused. All right. Give me a few hours. I'll find something. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. This wasn't about revenge. This was about respect, something I should have demanded a long time ago. And by the time I was done, they were all going to learn that I wasn't the kind of man you humiliate and walk away from. This was just the beginning. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the empty road ahead. The silence inside the vehicle was suffocating, but my mind was anything but quiet. Thoughts raced, replaying the events of the evening over and over. The slap. The silence. My wife's words. Apologize to her. Those 3 words had shattered something inside me, something that had been fragile for years but had somehow managed to hold on. Until now. I had spent so much time trying to fit into their world, trying to prove myself to a family that never wanted me in the first place. I had convinced myself that love required patience, that enduring their cruelty was just the price I had to pay for being with the woman I loved. But love without respect isn't love at all. It's just control disguised as something softer. Something I had been too blind to see. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. A message. Got something. Meet me in an hour. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. That was fast. Then again, my friend had always been efficient when it came to digging up dirt on people. If there was something to be found on her mother, he was the one who would uncover it. I started the car and pulled onto the road, my hands steady on the wheel. There was no hesitation anymore, no doubt creeping in, no second-guessing whether I was making the right choice. The decision had already been made for me. The moment my wife had chosen her mother over me, she had also chosen to lose me. The meeting spot was a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of downtown. A place where no one asked questions, where secrets could be exchanged over cheap whiskey and silence. I walked inside, scanning the room until I found him sitting in a booth in the back, his laptop open in front of him, a smirk playing on his lips. You got here quick, he said, taking a sip from his drink. I'm not in the mood for small talk, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. What did you find? He turned the laptop around, tapping the screen. Plenty. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the documents, the screenshots, the financial records. Large sums of money wired to a private investigator. Real estate properties under a false name. And then the real bombshell, an affair. I exhaled sharply, running a hand over my jaw. She's been cheating on her husband? For years, he confirmed. And she's been covering it up with fake business trips and shell accounts. The PI she's been paying? He's not just digging into other people's dirt. He's been cleaning up hers. I stared at the screen, my mind working through the implications. The woman who had spent years looking down on me, treating me like I was beneath her, was nothing more than a fraud. A liar. A hypocrite hiding behind a carefully curated image of wealth and power. She's funneled hundreds of thousands through these accounts, my friend continued, pulling up another document. I don't know what she was planning, but it sure as hell wasn't legal. If this gets out, she's finished. I leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. I should have felt satisfied. Maybe even vindicated. But all I felt was a cold, quiet certainty. This was bigger than just me. Bigger than just one slap, one humiliation. This was about taking back control. What are you going to do with this? He asked, watching me carefully. I stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the laptop. I'm going to let her bury herself. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Meaning, I said, standing up. I'm not just going to throw this at her and watch her squirm. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to let her think she's won. Let her think I walked away humiliated. And when she least expects it, I'll make sure everyone sees her for who she really is. He let out a low chuckle. I like this version of you. I didn't answer. Because this wasn't a new version of me. This was just the man I had buried under years of trying to be someone else. I left the bar, my next steps already forming in my mind. First, I would go home. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see how my wife acted now that she thought I was the one who had walked away defeated. I needed to see if there was even a shred of guilt in her, or if she had already moved on from the man she was supposed to stand beside. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. Maybe it was just my own perception, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place where I had overstayed my welcome. I stepped inside. She was sitting on the couch, her phone in her hands, scrolling through something with an unreadable expression. She barely looked up when I entered. You're back, she said, her tone flat. I didn't answer right away. I studied her, trying to see if there was any remorse, any regret. But there was nothing. Just indifference. I let out a slow breath, walking past her toward the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady, my heartbeat calm. She finally set her phone down, watching me. Are we going to talk about what happened? I took a sip before setting the glass down. What's there to talk about? She scoffed. You embarrassed my mother tonight. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. I embarrassed her? I repeated. She slapped me in front of everyone, and you told me to apologize. She shifted in her seat, arms crossing. You know how she is. She's strict. She was raised differently. She values respect. I turned to face her fully, my expression unreadable. And what about me? Do you value my respect? She opened her mouth but hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? It was one night. One argument. Are you really going to act like our entire marriage is ruined because of it? I exhaled through my nose, my jaw tightening. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Our marriage was ruined long before tonight. Her expression flickered, something like shock, maybe even fear. But she covered it quickly. You're being dramatic. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally seeing things clearly. She frowned. What does that mean? I didn't answer. I just turned and walked past her, heading upstairs. Where are you going? She called after me. To get some sleep, I said without looking back. But that was a lie. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to think. Think about every year I had wasted trying to be good enough for people who would never respect me. Think about how I had let myself become someone who tolerated being treated like an afterthought. Most importantly, I was going to think about what came next. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, but sleep never came. My mind was too awake, too alive with everything that had unraveled over the past few hours. The slap was nothing compared to the silence that followed, to my wife's cold indifference, to the weight of the realization that I had spent years sacrificing for someone who had never truly valued me. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became this wasn't the first time she had chosen her mother over me. It had been happening for years, in small ways, in ways I had brushed off, convinced myself weren't worth a fight. But tonight had laid it all out in the open. There was no going back now. At some point, I must have drifted into a light, restless sleep because the next thing I knew, the first light of morning was creeping through the blinds. I could hear movement downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes, the muffled sound of my wife on the phone. I didn't rush to get up. I just lay there, taking in the stillness of the room, the house, my life. It all felt unfamiliar now, like a place I had been a guest in rather than a home I had built. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe I had never really belonged here at all. When I finally got up and made my way downstairs, she was sitting at the dining table, coffee in hand, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I entered, as if last night had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Like nothing had changed. "You're up early," she said, her tone neutral, detached. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my movements slow, deliberate. "Didn't sleep much." She nodded like she expected that, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We should talk." I sat across from her, meeting her gaze. "About what?" She set her phone down, exhaling as if this conversation was something she had to force herself to get through. "About last night. About how you walked out in the middle of dinner and embarrassed my family." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "That's what this is about? My reaction? Not the fact that your mother slapped me in front of everyone." She rolled her eyes. "You're acting like a victim." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "I'm not acting like anything. I'm just finally seeing things for what they are." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, I know my mother can be difficult. But that's just how she is. She doesn't mean any harm." I raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't mean any harm?" I repeated, my voice calm but edged with something sharp. "She slapped me. Humiliated me. Called me disgusting. And you told me to apologize." She hesitated just for a second but then shook her head. "You know she has high standards. She was raised to expect a certain kind of behavior from people." I took a slow sip of my coffee before setting it down. And what exactly was my crime? Existing in her presence. She crossed her arms, frustration clear on her face. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I studied her carefully, looking for something, regret, guilt, a flicker of realization. But there was nothing. Just impatience. "Let me ask you something," I said, my voice steady. "If I had slapped your mother last night, in front of everyone, what would you have done?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was long enough. I nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She sat back, folding her arms tighter around herself. "You're looking for reasons to be mad." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, I'm looking at the reasons I should have been mad a long time ago." She exhaled, tapping her nails against the mug. "So, what now? You're going to hold a grudge? Punish me for something my mother did?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the house we had built together, the house where I had spent years convincing myself that love was enough, that if I just tried a little harder, I could make this work. Finally, I met her gaze. "I'm done." She frowned. "Done with what?" "With this." I gestured between us. "With trying to prove myself to you. With being the only one in this marriage who fights for it. With pretending that this is normal." She stared at me, something flickering in her expression, confusion, maybe even fear. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I stood, setting my mug in the sink. "You didn't even hesitate last night. Not once. You saw what she did, and your first instinct was to take her side. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice." She stood too, her movements sharp. "And you're going to throw everything away over one bad night?" I let out a breath, shaking my head. "This isn't about one night. This is about years of watching you put her first, of letting her walk all over me while you stood by and did nothing. I just refused to see it before." She clenched her jaw. "So what, you're leaving me?" I met her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing. No longing. No desperation to fix things. Just clarity. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I know I can't keep living like this." She was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I exhaled slowly, nodding. "I know." And that was the problem. She hadn't meant to hurt me because she had never even considered how I felt in the first place. I turned and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me. I didn't stop. To clear my head. I stepped outside, letting the cool morning air wash over me. My phone buzzed again. A message from my friend. "Meet me in an hour. You're gonna want to see this." I stared at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone. I had spent years swallowing my pride, tolerating the way they looked down on me, convincing myself that it was all worth it for love. But love wasn't supposed to feel like this. I slid into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. because I had a feeling that by the end of today, everything was going to change. I drove in silence, the low hum of the engine the only sound filling the car. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, my thoughts spiraling as I replayed the conversation with my wife over and over. There was a time when I would have done anything to fix this marriage. A time when I would have swallowed my pride, apologized even when I wasn't in the wrong, just to keep the peace. But that time was gone. She had made her choice. And now I was making mine. When I pulled into the parking lot of the small cafe where I was supposed to meet my friend, I took a moment before getting out of the car. I needed to calm the storm inside me. My emotions were a mix of frustration, exhaustion, and something else, something sharper. Resolve. I wasn't just walking away from a toxic marriage. I was walking towards something. I stepped inside the cafe, the smell of fresh coffee thick in the air. He was already there, sitting at a booth in the back, a folder in front of him. The moment he saw me, he smirked. "Took you long enough," he said, sliding the folder across the table as I sat down. I ignored his jab and flipped open the folder, my eyes scanning the documents, the pictures, the evidence. I had already known Gloria, my wife's mother, was hiding something. But this? This was worse than I expected. Bank transactions, huge sums of money being funneled into private accounts. A series of business deals that didn't quite add up. And then, the most damning piece of all, photos of her with a man who was very much not her husband. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my jaw. "How long has this been going on?" "For years," he replied, sipping his coffee like this was just another day at the office. "She's been cheating on Richard since before you even married into the family. But that's not all." I looked up, waiting. "She's also been paying a PI to dig into you." That made me pause. "Me?" He nodded, tapping the papers. "She's had someone looking into your past, your finances, even your work history. She's been looking for anything to use against you." A slow wave of realization settled over me. She hadn't just disliked me. She had been actively trying to ruin me. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger rising inside me. He shrugged. "Because she wanted you gone. And if she couldn't get rid of you through her usual manipulation, she was going to destroy you another way." I sat back, staring at the folder. I had always known Gloria saw me as less, as someone who didn't deserve to be in her family. But this went beyond anything I had imagined. My friend leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The real question is, what are you going to do about it?" I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I had two choices. I could walk away, file for divorce, leave it all behind, and let karma take its course. Or I could make sure they felt what they had put me through. I closed the folder. "I'm going to let her destroy herself." He smirked. "Good answer." I took the folder and left, my next steps already forming in my mind. I wasn't going to confront Gloria, not yet. She had spent years controlling the people around her, manipulating them into thinking she was untouchable. I was going to let her think she had one. And then I was going to make sure everyone saw her for who she really was. By the time I got back home, my wife was waiting for me in the living room. Her arms were crossed, her face set in a frown. "Where have you been?" she asked the moment I walked in. I set my keys down calmly. "Out." She scoffed. "That's not an answer." I turned to face her, my expression unreadable. "Do I owe you one?" She hesitated, and for the first time I saw something behind her eyes. Fear. Maybe she could feel it. Maybe she knew, deep down, that something had shifted. "What's going on with you?" she asked, softer now. I took a slow breath, considering my words carefully. I could have told her everything right then and there. I could have handed her the folder and let her see the kind of woman her mother really was. But I didn't. Because I wasn't just looking for an argument. I was looking for the end. So instead, I just shook my head. "You'll find out soon enough." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being cryptic and dramatic." I smiled. "Or maybe I'm just done pretending." She crossed her arms tighter. "Done with what?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "With this. With you. With your mother. With a marriage where I'm expected to be a bystander while you let her treat me like garbage." She opened her mouth, but I wasn't finished. "You made your choice last night," I said, my voice cold now. "You told me to apologize to the woman who humiliated me. You stood by while she degraded me in front of your entire family. And you didn't even flinch." Her expression faltered just for a second. "I was trying to keep the peace." "There is no peace," I interrupted. "There never was." Silence stretched between us. Finally, she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "So what now?" "You're leaving." I exhaled slowly. "Not yet." Her frown deepened. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. I just turned and walked upstairs. Because when I left, I wanted it to be permanent. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. I had everything I needed. The evidence. The truth. The power to flip the script on the woman who had spent years trying to break me. I could take it to Richard, her husband. I could take it to the media. I could make sure everyone knew who Gloria really was. But something told me I needed to be patient. Let her think she was safe. Let her think she was in control. And then I would watch her world burn. I woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen, sitting in the quiet stillness of the house that no longer felt like mine. My wife was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed, unaware that something irreversible had already started. I didn't envy her. She was about to learn the hard way that blind loyalty to the wrong person always comes with a cost. I moved through the house silently, grabbing my keys and slipping outside before she even stirred. I had things to do, and today wasn't just another day. Today, I set the pieces in motion. I drove straight to Richard's house. The man had no idea what was coming, and part of me almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then I remembered that he, like everyone else, had stood by all these years, enabling Gloria, allowing her to dictate and manipulate and control without consequence. He had chosen comfort over truth, and now he was going to pay for it. When I arrived, the house looked dark, almost lifeless. I knocked hard, not caring if I woke him up. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and Richard stood there, his robe loosely tied, his eyes groggy. "This better be good," he muttered, rubbing his face. "Oh, it is." I held up the folder, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're going to want to sit down." He frowned but closed the door behind me, leading me into his study. The room smelled like cigars and old books, lined with shelves filled with expensive artifacts, things meant to impress guests rather than actually be enjoyed. A perfect reflection of the man who owned them. I tossed the folder onto the desk. "Open it." Richard looked at me for a long moment before sighing and pulling out a chair. He flipped the folder open, his fingers trailing over the pages, his expression shifting as he read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something colder. The room was silent for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "You're sure about this?" His voice was low, quiet, controlled, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "Everything in there is real," I said. "The accounts, the money, the private investigator she hired to dig into me. And, of course, the affair." Richard swallowed, flipping through the photos. I knew she had secrets, he admitted, more to himself than to me. "But this is," he trailed off, shaking his head. "She's been playing you, Richard," I said, watching him carefully. "For years. She's been playing everyone." He exhaled sharply, setting the papers down. His hands were clenched into fists. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I know you're a man who values his reputation," I said smoothly. "And once this gets out, Gloria's going to bring you down with her. Unless, of course, you get ahead of it." His eyes narrowed. "You want me to do something about this?" I leaned forward. "I don't want anything from you, Richard. But I think you know what needs to be done." He let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "Divorce." I nodded. "That's a start." Another long silence stretched between us. Richard wasn't a stupid man. He knew this was the end of his marriage. The only question now was how messy he wanted it to be. Finally, he stood, closing the folder with finality. "She's going to fight this." I smirked. "Let her." He let out a humorless chuckle. "You don't care about the fallout?" I shrugged. "Fallout's coming whether I like it or not. The difference is I'm ready for it." Richard stared at me, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, I saw something that had never been there before: respect. He extended a hand. "Consider us on the same side, then." I shook it. Finally, I left him there, standing in the ruins of his marriage, knowing that before the day was over, Gloria's world was about to come crashing down. By the time I got home, the storm had already started brewing. My wife was pacing in the kitchen, her phone clenched in her hand. The moment I walked in, she turned to me, her face twisted in frustration. "What did you do?" I set my keys down calmly. "Good morning to you too." She stepped forward, eyes flashing. "Don't play dumb. My mother is losing it. Richard came over this morning and told her he's filing for divorce." I tilted my head. "Wow. What a shock." Her jaw tightened. "You had something to do with this." I didn't bother denying it. "And if I did?" She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You don't understand what you've done. My mother is a liar, a manipulator, a woman who has spent years controlling you, controlling Richard, controlling me. And now, she's finally facing the consequences." She swallowed hard. "She's still my mother. And I was your husband," I shot back. "Didn't seem to matter much when she slapped me in front of your whole family, did it?" She flinched. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. "You destroyed my family," she whispered. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "No. She did that. I just made sure everyone finally saw the truth. Her hands clenched at her sides. I don't even know who you are anymore. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Maybe you never did. The front door slammed open before she could respond, and there she was. Gloria. She stormed in, her face flushed with anger, her hands trembling as she pointed at me. You little rat, she hissed. You think you can ruin me? You think you can come into my family, take everything I've built, and just walk away? I met her glare without blinking. I don't have to ruin you, Gloria. You did that all on your own. She turned to my wife, gripping her arm. You will fix this. But for the first time, my wife didn't immediately cave. She hesitated, looking between me and her mother, torn in a way she had never been before. I saw the exact moment it hit her. The exact second she realized she had chosen the wrong side. Mom, she said quietly. Maybe you should leave. Gloria froze. Slowly, she turned to face her daughter, her expression one of pure disbelief. Excuse me. My wife swallowed. This isn't his fault. You did this to yourself. For a moment, Gloria said nothing. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out. The door slammed shut behind her, and just like that, it was over. I stood there, watching my wife, waiting for her next move. She let out a shaky breath. I don't know what happens now. I nodded, my voice calm. I do. She looked up at me, searching my face for something, hope maybe? A sign that we could still fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. I turned and walked upstairs, already knowing the next step. Because I wasn't staying. I stood in the bedroom, staring at the suitcase on the bed. The zipper was halfway closed, the contents packed with quiet finality. This house, this life, I was done with it. There was no fixing what had already shattered. Downstairs, the house was silent, but I could feel the weight of my wife's presence lingering in the air. She hadn't spoken since her mother stormed out. Maybe she was still sitting on the couch, trying to process everything, or maybe she was standing in the doorway, waiting for me to come downstairs and say something, anything that would make this all go away. But there was nothing left to say. I zipped up the suitcase, grabbed the handle, and took one last look around the bedroom, the place where we had once made promises that now meant nothing. Then I walked out. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, she was there. Not crying, not yelling, just watching. You're really leaving, she said quietly. I nodded. Yeah. Her arms were crossed, but I could see it, the slight tremble in her fingers, the way her breathing was just a little too controlled. She was trying to hold it together, but the cracks were there. You're throwing everything away, she whispered. I let out a slow breath. No. I was everything away. You just didn't notice. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I don't want this to end like this. I tilted my head. What did you think was going to happen? She looked away, and for the first time I saw regret flicker in her expression. Maybe she was finally realizing that she had spent years putting her mother's needs above mine. Maybe she was finally understanding that she had let me go long before I decided to walk away. I don't know, she admitted. I nodded, adjusting my grip on the suitcase handle. That's the problem. She blinked up at me, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something else. Maybe she was about to ask me to stay. Maybe she was about to tell me she still loved me. But it didn't matter. Because I didn't love her anymore. Not the way I used to. Not the way a man should love his wife. And even if I did, love without respect isn't love at all. I turned toward the door. She took a step forward. Wait. I paused, my fingers hovering over the doorknob. She hesitated. I made a mistake. I sighed, glancing over my shoulder. Yeah, you did. She let out a shaky breath. Do you think we could ever fix this? I studied her carefully, and for a brief moment I almost wished I could lie. That I could tell her that this was just a rough patch, that we could go back to the way things were. But we couldn't. And we shouldn't. So instead I said the only thing that was true. No. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, stepping back, finally accepting what she had tried to deny for so long. I opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. This time I didn't look back. I spent the first few days in a hotel trying to clear my head. The silence was strange at first, but the more time passed, the more I realized how much I had needed it. No more walking on eggshells. No more tolerating veiled insults from people who had never accepted me. No more trying to force a marriage that had been doomed from the start. By the end of the week, I had already started looking for a new apartment. Something small. Something simple. Something that felt like mine. Meanwhile, Gloria's downfall was happening in real time. Richard had filed for divorce immediately, and because he had the evidence, she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The scandal spread fast. Friends she had once controlled started distancing themselves. The exclusive social circles she had built her life around closed their doors on her. And when the press caught wind of the financial fraud, it was over. By the time the legal battles started piling up, she was scrambling, trying to do damage control. But there was no spinning this. The world had finally seen her for what she really was, a fraud, a liar, a woman who had spent years building a kingdom of manipulation only to have it crumble beneath her feet. I wasn't surprised when my wife called me a week later. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. She hesitated before speaking. I just wanted to see how you were doing. I leaned against the counter of my temporary apartment. I'm doing fine. Silence. Then softly, I miss you. I closed my eyes briefly. Once, those words would have broken me. Once, I would have done anything to hear them, to believe them. But now? Now, they were just words. I exhaled. You miss who I used to be. She sniffled, and I knew she was crying. I wish we could start over. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. Me too. Another beat of silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I let the question sit in the air for a long moment before answering. I don't need to. A quiet sob broke through the phone, but I didn't waver. Because I wasn't saying it to hurt her. I was saying it because it was true. I didn't need to hold onto anger. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to spend another second wasting my life on what could have been. I had already let go. And that was the greatest freedom of all. A month later, I was settled into my new place. It was smaller, quieter, but for the first time in years, I actually felt at home. Carter came over one night, handing me a beer as we stood on the balcony looking out over the city. You don't seem miserable, he noted. I smirked. Should I be? He shrugged. Just saying. Most guys would be a wreck after what you went through. I took a sip of my drink, exhaling slowly. Maybe that's the difference. He raised an eyebrow. What? I turned to him, my voice calm. I'm not most guys. He laughed. Damn right you're not. We clinked our bottles together, letting the silence settle between us. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to please people who would never respect me. I was just living. And God, it felt good. One night, I found myself at an art gallery downtown. I wasn't really into art, but Carter had dragged me along, insisting I needed to get out and experience life. That's when I saw her. She was standing near a painting, her dark hair falling over one shoulder, studying the canvas like it held all the answers in the world. There was something about the way she carried herself, unapologetic, free. I walked over, standing beside her. You look like you actually understand this, I said. She turned, raising an eyebrow. And you look like you don't. I grinned. Guilty. She smirked. Maybe you just need a better guide. Maybe I did. And maybe for the first time I was finally ready. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.